What's up guys, TopTierYugioh here, and today I want to discuss how to evaluate different decks and then do some TCG metagame analysis. And so my goal in this video is to discuss what some of the top decks are, what the best deck is, and then why these decks are as good as they are, so that we can be more informed about the format and know what to prepare for if you're going to a tournament soon. But even if you're not, hopefully this video will help you figure out how to evaluate decks more effectively, and so let's go ahead and get started. And so first things first, we need to understand the 5 characteristics of the best deck. And these are 5 qualities that all decks share and that are important for a deck to be good. And so those 5 qualities are power, which is what your deck does, consistency, or how often your deck can do it, efficiency, which is how sustainable it is, your resource management, your recovery, and then we have utility, which is how many different things your deck can do, and then diversity, which is how differently that deck can be played. And so again, all decks share these characteristics in one way or another, but it's the extent in which these qualities are exemplified that separates the good decks from the bad ones, and we're going to use this to analyze the current format. And so what we're going to do in this video exactly is discuss the qualities of each deck and give them a score between 1 and 5, then do a weighted average of those scores because these qualities are not equal, like power and consistency are way more important than utility and diversity. And then what we're going to do is get that final score and use that to determine how good that deck actually is. And so every deck should have an overall score between 1 and 5 as well, and the better decks will be closer to 5. Next, based on those scores, we can categorize the decks by their viability. Colloquially, in this community, we talk about tiers. We look for what decks are going to be tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, tier whatever, and so I am going to organize the decks by tier as well. And now Pojo also does a really good job at this. I think they probably are the best at this so far. And they record the results of each event and determine tiers based on those results. So like if a deck has 65% or more of the tops, then it's going to be tier 0, between 15 and 65% is tier 1, between 5 and 15% of the top is tier 2, and then so on. And now the problem with this though is that it's purely based on the results, which means that results have to previously exist, making it a poor way of evaluating decks in the early stages of a format, or after the format changes or shifts. It also makes representation a huge factor as well. However, representation doesn't have anything to do with how good your deck actually is. And so for example, if there's 20 people in a tournament and 15 of them are playing Goki for some reason, like WWE is really popular, but you can expect Goki to have the most players in top cut and then probably win because 15 out of those 20 players are playing it. But it doesn't make Goki the best deck. Another issue with this is that of being too results oriented, because so many different variables go into tournament success that we cannot attribute all of them to the actual abilities of that deck. And so while Pojo's system is really good, it is inherently flawed. And these are the reasons why I like this system, because it allows us to objectively look at the qualities of each deck and determine how good that deck is from there. We don't need to see any results, we don't need to play it. It doesn't matter how many people are playing it, and we're just looking at the deck. And with that being said, I found these tiers to be most accurate. And so again, every deck's going to have a score between 1 and 5. Tier 0 decks, which are usually the ones that can single-handedly warp a format and are the type of decks where you have to play this deck or you're going to lose to it. Those decks have scores of generally 4.5 and above. An example of that would be Fusion Sub Zodiac, which I often talk about as an example, but that deck has a score of like around 4.6. And so it's just in that tier 0 category, and that's why it was as good as it was at the height of its power. Tier 1 decks usually make up the bulk of the format, they define the meta, and usually have the best chances at all levels of play. Those decks generally have scores between 4 and 4.5. An example for this current format is Goki, which I think have a score of about 4.1 right now. And we're going to talk more about these scores in depth later on in this video. We're going to go through each deck of the format, but just as an example. Then tier 2 decks have scores between 3.5 and 4, and usually these are like solid deck choices, like they're clearly a step below the tier 1 decks, but they're still not bad decks either. Again, these have a score between 3.5 and 4. And then we have tier 3 decks, and these are decks that can maybe get an invite or maybe top a regional if everything goes perfectly. And like again, we mentioned that so many variables go into tournament success that we can't attribute all of it to the deck. Well, if all of those other variables go your way, then a tier 3 deck can top, but only in those scenarios. And decks like this generally have scores between 3 and 3.5, and if your score is anything below a 3, then you're probably not worth the cardboard it's printed on. And so we don't talk about those decks. And so again, I found this to be the most accurate by fitting the results of premier events of past formats to their deck's scores. And so I looked at all the past formats over the past couple of years, and I independently scored a lot of the decks, and then looked at the data from the premier events and found that this was the most accurate. And so moving on, let's actually look at the decks of the current format. And we're going to start with Goki because I didn't mention that before. And so looking at Goki, and we're going to look at each of the 5 characteristics in order: power, consistency, efficiency, utility, and diversity. And again, we're going to give Goki a score. And so we're going to start with power. And so Goki, I think, are in that tier of the most powerful decks of the format. So they're going to get a 5 out of 5 here. But the reason why is that they're able to OTK on pretty much any turn they're able to play. They have the highest ceiling of the format because they're able to make the full Nightmare board. They can extra link. And so any deck that can do the full Nightmare board or extra link you or OTK like that, those are going to be 5 out of 5s in terms of power. And if we look at the consistency, again, Goki is one of the most consistent decks of the format. Goki's major combo requires 2 warrior monsters because you have to make a sold. They usually play upwards of like 20 warrior monsters, and so they have 20 cards to get them to where they want to be. That's definitely in the highest tier of consistency. And so I would also generally say that a deck that has like between 8 and 12 cards that do like anything to get you to any other card in your deck, those are also going to be a 5 out of 5 consistency. And so Goki off the bat is a really strong deck because it's 5 out of 5 in terms of both power and consistency. But again, Goki isn't the best deck, and so Goki is in like the highest tier of power and consistency, but it's not the best. And why is that? And so this question is what drove me to really look more into these different characteristics, because I knew there had to be more than just power and consistency, because if there weren't other things, Goki would be the best deck. And so the next characteristic is efficiency. And efficiency is all about how sustainable your deck is. It's about being able to make efficient plays. It's about having recovery. It's about being able to recycle your resources. And if we look at Goki, and if we look at what Goki is able to do, so if we go back to the power, Goki is powerful because it's able to do that whole Nightmare board. It can extra link you. But the problem with that in terms of efficiency is that you can't do it twice. Like, you can't recycle that play. It isn't sustainable. And so if you extra link your opponent, and then you get hit with a sphere mode, like, you no longer have the ability to ever extra link your opponent again, because you've used up all of those resources in your extra deck. Like, you've used up your Nightmares, you've used up your Trigate, you've used up your Firewall. Like, what are you doing afterwards? Not much. Now, one thing that Goki do have going for them is that making a sold is generally a really efficient play because you're using 2 monsters, and that's generally going to get you like 3 monsters in return, and so that's a really efficient play. And then all of the Gokis themselves float, and so they're not terrible. They have cards like Goki Rematch and Soul Charge to have a little bit of recursion, but again, they're not as efficient as other decks are, and so they're of relatively average consistency here, and so they get about a 3 out of 5. Next, moving on to utility, which is again how many different things your deck can do. Goki's main deck doesn't have that much utility, but the most of the utility that they get is from their extra deck, and being able to have access to the entire Nightmare suite of cards, I think is something that I would say is relatively average right now. Like, if your deck can feasibly make like Cerberus, Phoenix, Goblin, Unicorn, Griffin, or other Link 4s and stuff, then you have enough utility, I would say, because you have ways to destroy monsters, spells, and traps, shuffle any card back into the deck. You have Firewall, which can do stuff. If you can do that, you can make Borreload, which can deal with other monsters. And so just the Nightmares and having the ability to make a lot of links does give you a certain amount of utility. And so I would say they get about a 3 out of 5 on that. I'd say that's relatively average. Now, in order to be above average, you need to have that plus like main deck utility, which Goki lack. Like, Goki don't have ways to generate defense by themselves outside of like making their link monsters, or Goki don't have ways to break opponents' boards within their engine. And these are the things that prevent Goki from having a higher utility score. And then next, when it comes to diversity, Goki is a bit subpar because in terms of the different ways Goki can play the game, you don't really have very many options. Like, you're going to need to combo, or you're probably going to lose. Like, if your combos are not resolving, then the deck just doesn't do as much. When it comes to playing either role, Goki can effectively only be the beatdown because of their lack of efficiency. Like, they need to do their combo as soon as possible and then win as soon as possible, because if the game goes on for too long, they're going to run out of resources. And so Goki really only have one way to play and one way to win, and this really hurts their ability to play different roles and their diversity, which I would say only has a 2 out of 5. And so if we look at these scores all together, Goki have scores of 5, 5, 3, 3, and 2, And then again, we're going to do a weighted average of those scores because these qualities aren't equal. Power and consistency are more important than the others. Those are about 30% of your score. Efficiency is about 20%. Utility and diversity are each about 10%. And so when we take a weighted average of those scores, Goki gets a score of about 4.1, which again is in that tier 1 category, but it isn't like very high in it. Like 4.1 on the range of 4 to 4.5 puts it like in the lower tier 1, which makes sense with its results. Like Goki isn't like dominating tournaments, but it is a very solid choice. Next, I want to look at a really similar deck, and that is SPYRAL. And so SPYRAL are really similar in that they have a like really high ceiling. And so of course it's going to get a power score of 5 out of 5 because they can also do that full Nightmare board, but on top of that they can even summon Sleeper, and so they're even more powerful than Goki in some regards, although they can't make the extra link as frequently. But both decks are like that top level of power. But the big difference with SPYRAL is that they're not as consistent, and the reason for that is because you're playing other injury requirements, so you have to play those SPYRAL mission cards, which can sometimes be bricks. You have to play cards like Ibli, which can really hurt your combos. Like Goki can play around it sometimes, but in SPYRAL it's a lot harder to play around. And you generally just have so much more variance that it hurts the consistency a lot. And so the consistency is only average, about a 3 out of 5. And this really hurts SPYRAL scores because unlike Goki, it has essentially everything else. And so if you look at efficiency, SPYRAL are way more efficient due to cards like SPYRAL Mission Rescue and SPYRAL Resort. Those give you a consistent flow of resources. And now efficiency is only going to get a 4 out of 5 because while the deck can make highly efficient plays, summoning cards like Sleeper banishes them from the graveyard, making it hard to get them back. You're only going to be able to use Quick Fix's graveyard effect once or Drone's graveyard effect once. So the deck isn't able to do everything infinitely, but it can do them a lot. And so they do get a score of 4 for efficiency. When it comes to utility, once again, they have the whole Nightmare suite. They have their whole extra deck to access, and so they get at least average utility. But on top of that, they get cards like Tough, Agent, Drone, Sleeper, all of which do different things. So they have a couple of other effects on top of those Nightmares and extra deck cards that really give them that boost to be above average in terms of utility. And then if we look at diversity, SPYRAL have many different ways to play and win the game. They have the power to be the beatdown. They have the efficiency to be the control. They can beat you on card advantage. They can beat you in tempo. They can beat you in fire. They can utilize all 3 of the resources extremely well. And in the hands of the right player, SPYRALs can be a very dangerous deck. I think the big difference when looking at the diversity between Goki and SPYRAL is looking at what happens if you use Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries against either of them. And so if you used Reaper against Goki, the deck becomes really bad. Like it becomes like normal summon attack type deck. But if you Reaper against SPYRAL, that deck is actually still really good if they have access to Resort or Rescue. Like Rescue on the field, although it can be like sort of a brick, it's literally a +6 if you're able to use the effect over and over again. And Resort is a +1 every turn it's on the board while protecting you from targeting, which does bias some of your opponent's resources, which we again mentioned in the previous video is important. And so if you take those combos away, Goki are not really able to do as much versus SPYRAL, which can win in other ways. That's the main difference between one having like a diversity of 4 and the other having a diversity of 2. But now again, these qualities aren't equal, and so if we add up the score, SPYRAL only get a weighted average of a 4, which is less than 4.1, and so Goki is a better deck than SPYRAL right now. And that comes from the importance of consistency. And so even though SPYRAL is better in most categories, because we judge decks based on the ones that are able to do well at major events like YCSs, Nationals, it's hard for a deck like SPYRAL with lower consistency to do that because you're only allowed to lose like 2 times and maybe get a draw. Like if you lose 3 times, you're out. And you're going to lose like maybe once or twice to your own deck, and sometimes you just lose another game. Like it's much easier to lose 3 times when you're going to lose once or twice to yourself. And so now that we've discussed some of the more powerful decks in the format, now I want to discuss some of the more consistent decks. And so let's move on to Sky Strikers, and we're going to start with Pure. And so for Pure Sky Strikers, their power is relatively average. Like it's not good, it's nowhere near that of like Goki and SPYRAL. Like you cannot, with any hand possible in your deck, you cannot do like a full Nightmare combo or an extra link or anything. Like it is literally impossible. And so that power is relatively average. It's not low power because you're still able to do damage in the long term over the game. And anytime you have RAYE, you can do about 3,000 damage per turn, which puts your opponent on like a 3-turn clock if you know how to play correctly. And so it isn't low powered, but it definitely isn't high powered. And so I think a 3 is appropriate, definitely average. In terms of consistency though, pure Sky Strikers are one of the more consistent decks. The reason for this is that you have 3 Engage, 3 Hornibit, 3 Ray, and Rhoda, all that will get you to any other card in your deck. And so having 10 cards to get you to anything else makes it extremely consistent. And so for consistency, Sky Strikers will get a 5 out of 5. And then for efficiency, Sky Strikers are also top of the class because they're able to play effectively infinitely. And so between Kagari getting your spells back from the graveyard and Hercules Base shuffling your Link monsters and your spells back into your deck, you're able to use any of them an infinite number of times throughout the duel, effectively until you deck out from drawing off of Engage. But you don't even have to draw from Engage, so you can actually maybe never deck out, or just keep shuffling things back into the deck and never deck out. So there's so many ways to play infinitely in that deck that the resource management is just absurd, the recovery is insane. 5 out of 5 efficiency for sure. Definitely the best efficiency in the current metagame. And then if we look at the utility, again also another 5 out of 5 best in the class. Because if you look at all the different cards that Sky Strikers have access to, it's just insane. Like, they have cards to destroy monsters, destroy back row, negate monsters, special summon them from the graveyard, take control of them, make their own cards unaffected by other card effects. Like, there are just so many different cards that Sky Strikers have access to, on top of the extra deck too. Because while they can't do like the full Nightmare stuff, they can every now and then summon a couple Nightmares. Like, they can make Phoenix, they can make Cerberus, they can make Goblin, Unicorn, they can make Link 4s and stuff, but they just can't create like 10 to 12 Link materials like the other decks like Goki and SPYRAL can. But they do have access to them. And so having access to those on top of their insane main deck utility definitely gives them a 5 out of 5. And then when it comes to diversity, pure Sky Strikers only have a 3 out of 5. And the reason for this score is that they're efficient and consistent enough to usually play the control very well, but because of their low power, it makes it difficult to play the beatdown. So they can really only win in that one way, unless you like draw really well or you can have your opponent in sort of a bad position. But you're hardly ever going to be able to just like OTK your opponent, especially not in the early game. And while it's possible in the mid to late game to OTK, you have to get there first. Another reason to sort of mark down the diversity as well is sort of the deck's reliance on the spell cards, because if you're not able to activate your spells or if you're not able to search, you really can't do much in the deck. So having that one way of really doing things that funnel to your resources makes it easy for decks to stop you from doing what you do. And so again, being able to play through those different things and play past different things allows your deck to be more diverse. And so again, if we look at SPYRAL can play through plenty of floodgates, they can play through lots of hand traps, whereas Sky Strikers really don't always have that option. And so I would consider the diversity relatively average. And so again, if we take a weighted average of all of those scores, we're going to get a 4.2. And so far, this is the best deck. And I actually think once Sky Striker get everything like they have in the OCG, they have the abilities to be even tier 0. And so if we bump the power up to 4, which it might have after getting like the ability to OTK, once we get like Needle Fiber, Summon Sorceress, and Hayate, that goes up to a 4.5. This allows you to play the beatdown more effectively, which improves your diversity maybe to a 4, which boosted up to 4.6, which puts it in that tier 0 category, which is more in line with the OCG result. Like in the OCG, Sky Strikers are everywhere and they're just dominating. But here, without those cards, the deck has much lower power, which drops it just in that tier 1 category. And so again, that's just sort of a little example of how accurate this is, because we saw that once we added that little bit of power, it put it above 4.5, and that made it able to be tier 0 like it is in the OCG. But again, in the TCG, it's only a 4.2, which is good. It's a solid choice in the tier 1 category, but it isn't the best deck. And so for what I think the best deck is right now, is TRICKSTAR's. And so we're mainly going to be looking at the Sky Striker TRICKSTAR deck because it's just far better than pure TRICKSTAR's. The Sky Striker one is the one that's most prevalent in the metagame right now, so we're going to discuss that. And so if we look at the power is above average for sure. Like, it isn't able to do the full Nightmare combos like Goki or SPYRAL, so it's definitely a lower ceiling than those decks. But it's definitely more power than pure Sky Strikers. It's definitely more powerful than decks like ALTERGEIST. And so it's above average, but lower than the highest tier, which puts it at a 4. And just for other things within that sort of category, decks with a 4 in terms of power are able to sometimes OTK, maybe they can do game over the course of 1 to 2 turns easily, but they generally have no problem doing it, versus a deck like Sky Strikers. Whereas a deck like TRICKSTAR's, Any turn they have Candina on an open board, that can be game. Because that's, if they have like a second Lycoris, it can be Candina, double Lyco, and then like Reincarnation, and that's game. Or they can just do that Firewall OTK if you leave a monster on board with over 1600 attack. So Trickstars are able to kill you, they just can't do it quite as easily as a deck like Goki or Spiral can. Like Goki and Spiral, like a 5 out of 5 consistency is like if you have no hand traps, you're dead. Trickstars, that isn't always the case. But a 4 I think is very appropriate for them. Then when it comes to consistency, similar to pure Sky Strikers, they have 3 Terraformings, 3 Light Stage, and 3 Candinas to get them to pretty much anything they want. And then they have 3 Engage and 3 Hornet Drones to also get them to anything in the Sky Striker engine. And so they also have a lot of cards to get to every other card in their deck, making them a 5 out of 5 consistency. When it comes to efficiency, this is probably Sky Striker Trickstar's greatest weakness, although it isn't like a huge weakness, it is something. And so Sky Striker Trickstars are efficient in that they have really efficient plays, but they lack efficiency in that they don't have very good recovery. And so they have Reincarnation, that's something. You have like Kagari to get back your Hornet Drones and your Widow Anchor if you play that, or your other Sky Striker spell cards if you play them. But you're not really able to recycle your main plays as much. Like you can't do the TRICKSTAR play twice because you only play one TRICKSTAR. If your Firewall loop gets broken up by like a Ghost Ogre, you're gonna lose your Firewall and not be able to do it again. So like a lot of your plays are unrecyclable, but for the most part, you can do them over and over again. Like you can normal summon Candina, search Lycoris a lot. And so the deck has some efficiency, but it's not like inefficient, and it's definitely not like pure Sky Striker levels of efficiency either, because you're not able to play infinitely. Like you will eventually run out of resources. And so with that, I think they're about a 4. When it comes to utility, Trickstars are definitely above average. They have access to Light Stage, which deals with back row. They have access to Reincarnation, which is another form of defense. They have access to Afterburner, Jamming Wave, Widow Anchor, and any of the other Sky Striker cards that they play. Now they're not playing all of them like a pure deck would, but they're usually going to play 2 to 3 different Sky Striker cards other than Engage and Hornet Drones. So they have access to those. And then on top of that, they have access to the entire extra deck, including most of the Nightmare cards. And so they definitely have above average utility, similar to that of Spiral, so where they have access to their whole extra deck at any time. And then on top of that, a few select different main deck options. I would consider this to be about a 4, but I could also see where you might be willing to give it a 5. And then when it comes to diversity, Trickstar definitely get a 5 out of 5 because they can beat you in so many different ways. Trickstars have the ability to play the beatdown, they can play the control, they can manage all 3 resources, they can generate multiple lines of defense, have multiple plays, play through pretty much anything. Trickstars are definitely one of the most diverse decks of the format, if not the most diverse deck of the format. And I think if we just look at these 4, it is the most diverse. It has the best diversity, and that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to beat. It's one of the reasons why other decks struggle with it so much, because you have to worry about so many different things. You have to worry about, is that a Widow Anchor? Is that a Reincarnation? Am I going to get Droll reincarnated? Like, you don't know what they have. Is that a Scapegoat? Like, it's so hard. Or if you're trying to determine how you're going to win that game, you have to think like, if I want to be the control, can the Trickstar deck OTK me? Can I leave this monster on the board even though it has 2000 attack, or will I get OTK'd by Firewall and LILYBELL? At the same time, can I afford to try to be the beatdown when they have so much defense? Like, the diversity of the Trickstar deck makes it so hard to play against, and it's one of the reasons why it's the best deck of the format. And so again, in terms of the 5 qualities, Trickstars have scores of 4 in power, 5 in consistency, 4 in efficiency, 4 in utility, and a 5 in diversity. I think maybe some questionable ones might be, like, you could maybe say it's a 3 in efficiency or a 5 in utility. Like, it's weird, it's somewhere between both of those for each of them, I think. And so I think if we give, like, on the low end, so if we say like a 3 in efficiency and a 4 in utility, then it gives Trickstars a score of 4.2, which it makes them equal to pure Sky Strikers, which from the results we can sort of tell like isn't true. Like, Trickstars are definitely better, and so I think it makes sense that one of them has to be above that. So like, whether it's a 4 in efficiency, which boosts them up to 4.4, and then if we put a 5 for utility, they go up to 4.5, but 4.5 puts them in like their tier 0 category, which I don't think Trickstars are necessarily tier 0 yet this format. But if we look at YCS New Jersey, they definitely had some overwhelming dominance, but not quite tier 0, and so I'm not too sure about this one, but it's definitely between like 4.3 and 4.5. Like it's definitely better than everything else, but not quite tier 0 yet. Or it might just be better to adjust our definition of tier 0 to being scores that are strictly above 4.5 and not equal to 4.5. But even so, Trickstars are clearly the best deck of the format. And now that we have 4 different examples pretty much, I think it also helps to look at these comparatively. So like, Pure Sky Strikers had a power score of 3. Trickstars have a power of 4. And then Goki and Spiral have a power of 5. It makes sense that way. Like, Goki and Spiral are more powerful than Trickstars, which is more powerful than Sky Strikers. Like, that makes sense. If we look at consistency, Pure Sky Strikers, Trickstar, and Goki all have 5s. They're all more consistent than Spirals. And we're going to go through some different decks as well, because there are some 4s that I want to give as examples too. If we look at efficiency, Goki's only a 3. They're the least efficient out of these decks. Then we have Spiral and Trickstar, which can kind of do their plays over and over again. Like, they have very high efficient plays. They have a little bit of recovery, but they're nowhere near the efficiency of Pure Sky Strikers. If you look at utility, Pure Sky Strikers and Trickstars both have 5s, because they definitely have more utility than decks like Goki and Spiral. Goki only has a 3, Spiral has a 4, because Spiral has more than Goki. Like, if we look at all of these things comparatively, like, it makes sense. And I think that's sort of the most important thing about giving these scores, is that they make sense. And they do, which is great. And so let's move on to some other decks. So these are like definitely the tier 1 decks of the format. Next I want to talk about some honorable mentions, some decks that are actually really close in my opinion. The first of which being ABC, which is a deck that I talk about all the time on this channel, but ABC is not quite tier 1, but it's close. And so if we look at power, I would give ABC a score of a 4, because they're definitely less powerful than like Nightmare decks. Are not able to do the full Nightmare board, you're not extra linking, but you do have access to a powerful card in Buster, and you really can't like underrate that. And then also if we look at it from a damage output point of view, ABCs are able to OTK in a lot of games, so they are still really powerful, but they can't always do it. So it's sort of similar to Trickstars, where like, if they have a good hand and you have a bad hand, they will kill you, or if they have a good hand, they'll kill you, but it's not like guaranteed. Like, it isn't like if you don't have a hand trap, you're gonna auto lose that game, like it is against Spiral or Goki. Then if we look at consistency, like, we have 3 terraformings, 3 union hangers, maybe a set rotation if you want to go that route, but I wouldn't go that route. So you have at least 6 cards to get you to anything else that you want. Then you have like your 3 Bs, at least 3 Bs. You have a lot of cards to get you to your other cards within your engine, but really without union hanger, you're not able to do it. Even if you consider cards like Pot of Desires and, you know, Upstart Goblin and all those things, like, you're still lower consistency than decks like Pure Sky Strikers or Trickstars, or even Goki. And so again, I think the consistency is also above average, but it's about a 4. Like, you're more consistent than a deck like, let's say, Spiral, which got a 3, but less consistent than the others. If you look at efficiency, again, ABC is above average, because once you get access to the first Buster, you have access to all of your Busters. And so Buster's tag out effect is incredibly efficient, and you have a card like A to get your things back from the graveyard over and over. Efficiency for ABC is no problem. But again, you're not able to play infinitely, you will run out of Busters, and so that's why they only get about a 4. When it comes to utility, you have access to your whole extra deck, you can play Nightmares, so it's definitely at least average, but on top of that, you have the different effects of your ABC pieces, so like, you can make your things unaffected by monster spells or traps, and then you also have Buster itself. So again, above average, but less than that of decks like Sky Strikers and Trickstars probably, so that's why it's only a 4. And then when it comes to diversity, only about average, and the reason for that is you always have to make Buster. Like, if you're not making Buster, you're losing, and so that really funnels all of your plays and makes you play a certain way. Like, you have no options in the early game, like, you have to make Buster or else you just lose, like, your deck doesn't do enough. And so that's definitely problematic, and that funnel for your plays makes it easier for opponents to stop you. When it comes for different roles you can play, it's 100% dependent on whether or not you're able to do that. And so the diversity is definitely average. And now again, if we compare it to Goki, like, ABC without Buster is better than Goki without their combos. And so we're definitely more than Goki, but similar to that of like Pure Sky Strikers, to where like, once you get going, you have the option to do pretty much anything and play different ways, but you have to get there first. Versus decks like Trickstar, which from the get-go can just do whatever they want. And so if we score that, ABC gets a score of 3.9, which is right on the cusp of being tier 1, but not quite there yet. Another honorable mention is if we look at pendulums. And so if we look at pendulums in terms of power, they have a score of about a 4. Like they have access to their whole extra deck. They don't play the nightmares, but they can pretty much usually kill you if they go first and open decent. They can make pretty solid boards, like definitely more powerful than decks like Sky Strikers or Altergeist, but less powerful than like the full nightmare decks like Goki and Spiral. Kind of comparable to ABC. In terms of consistency, also very similar to ABC, so they're getting a score of a 4. Like you don't have as many cards to get you to where you want to be, and you're gonna always need like right scales. You're gonna need like you're gonna have to be able to make Electromite. When it comes to efficiency, you don't have the ability to keep like redoing most of your plays because you're gonna run out of extra deck resources. However, the pendulum mechanic does actually make it relatively efficient because you can always keep summoning back Jackal. You can always summon back a lot of your extra deck resources actually, or your pendulum monster extra deck resources. And then as long as you don't waste your Electromites, they're going to be able to summon them out at a pretty good rate as well. Electromite can also recover them from the extra deck, and then if you play the Magicians, Black Fang can get things back from the graveyard, and so you have some pretty efficient plays. Definitely above average, but not in the tier of pure Sky Strikers. And so I think that Pendulums also get a score of a 4. And so just like ABC, they get scores for 4 for power, consistency, and efficiency. The difference is when it comes to utility. ABC had a 4 for utility because they had main deck utility on top of extra deck utility, versus Pendulums only have extra deck utility, which is why they're only getting a 3. Because most Pendulum cards in the main deck actually don't do anything. Like none of the Magicians do anything, and all of the ones that like help you make Electromite only make Electromite. Like they don't do very much else. So that's just about average. But then when it comes to diversity, Pendulums are better than ABCs. They get a score of a 4 because they can effectively play either role a lot better. And now it does stink that they have to funnel their plays through their Pendulum summon. But even without Pendulum summoning, if they loop their Electromites together, they have the ability to make a lot of link plays. Like you can make between 4 to 6 link materials pre-Pendulum summon if you really wanted to. Like you can make a Borreload Dragon and then Pendulum summon if you wanted. And so I think it's that really puts them a bit above average in terms of diversity. And so again, just like ABCs, they're on that cusp of being tier 1, but not quite there yet. And so I think they get a score of about a 3.9. And now the final deck that I want to mention is Altergeist. And Altergeist I think is the perfect example for a deck that is probably only as good as it is because people actually play it. Which they don't anymore, but like if you look at the last YCS, I had a few Altergeist tops, and I think it had that like more Altergeist tops than Pendulum and ABC tops because more people played Altergeist then. Like people weren't playing ABC or Pendulums because they didn't think that they were viable choices, but they were actually much better choices than Altergeist. And so if we look at Altergeist from this perspective, if we look at the power, it's definitely not like high power. Like it isn't like Spiral or Goki, but it's also less than like ABC and Pendulum, which are 4s. It's less than TRICKSTAR, which is a 4, and kind of similar to pure Sky Strikers, to where they have the ability to like do damage, but only after able to play at like maximum efficiency. So like once they get their engine going, maybe, but they have to get there first. And you're definitely never going to be worried about getting OTK'd by the Altergeist player. And so their power is a 3 at best. If you look at efficiency, they have cards like Multi-Faker at 3, they have Spoofing, they have Marionetter to get to any other traps. So they have relatively decent access to most of their cards at any point in time. But again, not as consistent as a deck like Goki, TRICKSTAR, or pure Sky Strikers. So they get a 4 for consistency. In terms of efficiency, they also get a 4 because they have the ability to recycle some of their plays. Like you have cards like Silk to bounce back your traps. You have Manifestation, getting things back from the graveyard. You're searching all of them with LILYBELL and HEXSTIA. So their efficiency is pretty good. But again, lower than that of pure Sky Strikers, so not quite a 5. And they have trouble making highly efficient plays because most of their traps are neg 1s. So again, 4 out of 5 for efficiency. When it comes to utility, they don't quite have access to a lot of things in the extra deck. Like the most things you're going to probably worry about are maybe HEXSTIA, maybe the occasional Nightmare, but it's generally not going to be something to worry about. But in their main deck, they do have cards like Protocol to deal with monster effects. They have LILYBELL destroying things on the field. They have HEXSTIA to negate spells and traps. So they have different things that they can get to usually. And so their utilities maybe average to slightly above average, so like maybe between 3 and 4. And then for diversity, they get about a 3. because they're only going to win by sort of outgrinding you with their resources and not really letting you play. Like, that's their only way of winning. They're not going to be able to like OTK you at any point in time, like unless they open absurd and you have like a clear board, which isn't very likely. And so again, I think a 3 for diversity is pretty fair. And so if we look at their score, they get about a 3.5 if utility is a 3. If we decide to be generous and give them a 4 for utility, it goes up to a 3.6, which is still like well below everything else so far. Now, it's not to say it's like a terrible deck, because again, it is able to do well, but it's just harder. Like, it's a solid tier 2 deck. Now, it's not to say tier 2 decks can't compete, like ALTERGEIST, ABC, Pendulum, they're all tier 2 decks, but they can all still compete. Like, if the player is good enough with them, you're going to have a solid chance. But also, because they do have a chance, it doesn't mean that they aren't inherently worse than the tier 1 decks, which they are. Like, a deck like ALTERGEIST is just inherently worse than a deck like GOKI or TRICKSTAR or Sky Strikers. Like, it's just a worse deck. And so if we give just a finalized ranking, the tier 1 decks of the current format are Sky Strikers, TRICKSTARs, which use Sky Strikers, then we have GOKI and SPYRAL, with SPYRAL being on the cusp of being tier 1 and tier 2. In the tier 2 category, we have ABCs, Pendulums, and ALTERGEIST, and the tier 3 decks are just like everything else. And now this isn't all inclusive, I may have forgot something. I was sure to include most of the tier 1 decks or all of the tier 1 decks, but I might have missed the tier 2 deck. If you think there's a deck I may have missed, let me know in the comment section below and we can discuss it down there. And so let me know what you guys think of this video. Maybe this makes a lot of sense, maybe it didn't. But if anything, I hope it helps us think more about these 5 characteristics, because I think they are all important. Like, we need to understand how they work when it comes to evaluating different decks. And so again, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please like it, subscribe to the channel, I'd really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys in the next video.